Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran and the fall of an empire. Part 1. Birth and early family background. On October 26, 1919, in the capital city of Tehran, a child was born whose destiny would intertwine with the fate of an entire nation. This child, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, would eventually ascend to the peacock throne as the last Shah of Iran, overseeing a reign marked by rapid modernization, economic expansion, autocratic rule, and ultimately, revolutionary overthrow. Yet before he became a towering figure in the history of modern Iran, his early years were shaped by his family's background, the political upheavals of his time, and his complex relationship with his father, Reza Khan, who would later become Reza Shah Pahlavi, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty. Mohammad Reza was born into a family that, at the time of his birth, was not yet royalty. His father, Reza Khan, was a military officer in the Persian Cossack Brigade, an elite cavalry unit that played a significant role in shaping Iran's modern military. At the time of Mohammad Reza's birth, Reza Khan was not yet Shah, but his ambitions were already well known. He had risen from humble beginnings, serving as a soldier before gradually ascending through the ranks to become a brigadier general. Reza Khan's lineage traced back to the Mazandaran region, a lush and mountainous province in northern Iran. His family hailed from Alasht, a small village in SAVAK County. While his origins were modest, his aspirations were anything but. Determined and strong-willed, Reza Khan had spent much of his early life navigating the political and military landscapes of Iran, which was at that time still ruled by the weakening Qajar dynasty. On his mother's side, Mohammad Reza's lineage was equally intriguing. His mother, Taj ul-Muluk, was of Azerbaijani and Georgian descent. Her family had emigrated from the Caucasus to Iran following the Russo-Persian Wars, when Iran was forced to cede its territories in the region to the expanding Russian Empire. Though she was an immigrant, she quickly assimilated into Iranian courtly life, and through her marriage to Reza Khan, became part of a family that would soon seize the country's throne. The Pahlavi household was filled with children, as Mohammad Reza was one of 11 siblings. Among them, his twin sister, Princess Ashraf Pahlavi, would become one of his closest confidants and political allies throughout his life. While they were twins, their personalities were starkly different. Where Mohammad Reza was often described as reserved and uncertain, Ashraf was bold, outspoken, and politically shrewd. At the time of his birth, Mohammad Reza and his siblings were not royalty. Their father, though an influential figure in the military, had not yet claimed the throne. This meant that their upbringing, while privileged, was not entirely royal. However, Reza Khan was convinced that his fate was tied to his son's birth. Seeing Mohammad Reza's arrival in 1919 as an omen of good fortune, he affectionately nicknamed his son Koshgadam, meaning bird of good omen. As his father's political career advanced, so too did the family's status. In 1921, just 2 years after Mohammad Reza's birth, Reza Khan played a central role in a military coup that dramatically altered Iran's political landscape. The coup, which led to the deposition of the ineffective Qajar ruler Ahmad Shah, set the stage for Reza Khan's eventual rise to power. However, as he consolidated control, he faced a dilemma. He lacked a proper surname. At the time, most Iranians did not have hereditary last names, and surnames were only becoming a legal necessity due to new administrative reforms. Determined to forge a new national identity, Reza Khan chose the name Pahlavi for his family, linking his lineage to Iran's ancient past. The term Pahlavi referred to Middle Persian, a language historically associated with the pre-Islamic Sasanian Empire. By adopting this name, Reza Khan was not only giving his family a proper surname, but also creating a symbolic connection between his rule and Iran's ancient imperial heritage. With his father's ambitions growing, Mohammad Reza's life underwent a transformation. On April 24, 1926, when Reza Khan crowned himself as Reza Shah Pahlavi, the Pahlavi family was officially elevated to royal status. On the same day, young Mohammad Reza was proclaimed the Crown Prince of Iran, securing his place as the heir to his father's newly established throne. From this point forward, Mohammad Reza's upbringing took on an entirely different course. No longer just the son of a powerful military officer, he was now the Crown Prince of Iran, a title that would come with immense expectations, pressures, and responsibilities. His childhood, once relatively private, now became a matter of national interest. The boy who was once an ordinary member of an influential family was now being groomed for kingship. Thus began the early life of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a prince whose destiny would be shaped by the ambitions of his father, the heritage of his mother, and the turbulent times into which he was born. Part 2, A Crown Prince in His Father's Shadow. With the coronation of Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1926, the newly established Pahlavi dynasty set out to modernize Iran with sweeping reforms. At the heart of this transformation was young Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who at the age of 6 was declared crown prince. Overnight, his life became one of intense scrutiny, privilege, and most of all, preparation. He was no longer merely the son of a military strongman, he was the heir to the peacock throne, destined to inherit his father's vision for Iran. Yet despite the grandeur that surrounded his title, Mohammad Reza's childhood was anything but carefree. His father, Reza Shah, was a towering and intimidating figure, known for his ruthless discipline and unyielding expectations. Mohammad Reza grew up under the shadow of a man whose mere presence could command fear and respect. Even within the walls of the royal palaces, Reza Shah's authority was absolute. He was a man who despised weakness and was deeply influenced by the belief that displays of affection towards sons could lead to moral decay. He imposed a rigid and often cold relationship with Mohammad Reza, ensuring that his son would grow up strong, independent, and unflinching. While the young prince was the favorite of his father, this favoritism did not translate into warmth or tenderness. Reza Shah's method of child-rearing was deeply rooted in his military background. He had an unshakable belief in discipline, order, and control. He never addressed his son with the informal you, opting instead for the formal shoma, sir, a term that reinforced hierarchy and distance. In turn, the young prince was required to address his father with the same formality. Affection, as far as Reza Shah was concerned, was a sign of weakness. This austere upbringing left its mark on Mohammad Reza, shaping his character in profound ways. He became a reserved and cautious boy, deeply insecure in the presence of his father. Iranian-American historian Abbas Milani described him as a young man who lacked self-confidence, deeply fearful of disappointing the towering figure that ruled over him. His own recollections in later years paint a picture of a boy growing up in quiet anxiety, longing for approval that would never come in the form of paternal love. A Polish journalist, Ryszard Kapuscinski, who later studied photographs of Reza Shah and his son, noted the stark contrast in their demeanor. In every image, the father appeared composed, self-assured, and immovable, while Mohammad Reza seemed nervous, unsure, and jittery, a boy who had yet to grow into the shoes of the role he had been born into. Despite his fears, Mohammad Reza was determined to meet his father's expectations. From an early age, he was subjected to rigorous training designed to shape him into a ruler. Unlike ordinary Iranian children, he was surrounded by a carefully selected group of tutors, military officers, and intellectuals who were tasked with preparing him for his future role. This environment did not allow for indulgences in childhood innocence. While other children played freely in the streets of Tehran, Mohammad Reza's world was filled with studies in governance, military tactics, and history. He was drilled on the importance of leadership, statecraft, and obedience. Even his mother, Taj ul-Maluk, who was one of his few sources of emotional support, was instructed to treat him with the formal deference owed to a future king. Yet despite his father's efforts to mold him into a formidable leader, there was one significant aspect in which father and son differed: personality. Where Reza Shah was an imposing and physically powerful man, standing over 6 feet 4 inches tall, his son was smaller in stature and softer in temperament. The young prince was introspective, preferring books and quiet reflection to the boisterous displays of military might that his father adored. He developed a love for literature, particularly French poetry, and showed an early appreciation for art and culture. interests that were far removed from the hard-nosed militarism that defined Reza Shah's worldview. It was perhaps this difference in temperament that made Reza Shah worry about his son's suitability as a future ruler. He was determined to toughen him up, ensuring that Mohammad Reza would never be seen as weak. To this end, he arranged for his son to be surrounded by military officers who were instructed to instill in him discipline and resilience. The young prince was often taken on inspections of the army, where he was expected to learn the importance of loyalty and command. Reza Shah also sought to shape his son's worldview through exposure to strong, autocratic leaders. He was an admirer of Adolf Hitler, not for the Nazi leader's ideology, but because of his rise from obscurity to power, something that resonated with Reza Shah's own journey. He often spoke to Mohammad Reza about the idea of historical greatness, emphasizing that leaders were meant to be strong-willed and unyielding. The concept of democracy held little appeal for Reza Shah, who saw himself as a man of destiny, shaping Iran through sheer force of will. As much as Mohammad Reza feared his father, he also developed a sense of admiration for his strength. Reza Shah was, in many ways, a symbol of absolute authority, powerful, decisive, and unwavering. The young prince observed this closely, internalizing the belief that strong leadership was essential for Iran's survival. Yet at the same time, he resented the coldness with which he was treated. Throughout his life, he would struggle with the contradictions of this relationship, oscillating between admiration and resentment for the man who had shaped him. While Reza Shah dominated the young prince's life, there was another figure who played an equally crucial role in shaping his identity: his twin sister, Princess Ashraf Pahlavi. Unlike Mohammad Reza, Ashraf was outspoken, ambitious, and politically astute. From an early age, she displayed a fierce intelligence and a willingness to challenge authority, something that set her apart from her more reserved twin. The bond between the twins was unique and unbreakable. Ashraf often acted as Mohammad Reza's protector, standing up for him when their father's discipline became too harsh. As they grew older, she would become one of his closest advisors and defenders, playing a pivotal role in his political life. While Reza Shah was grooming Mohammad Reza to be a future king, Ashraf was carving her own path, one that would see her emerge as one of the most powerful women in Iran. Despite the rigid and often painful structure of his early life, Mohammad Reza did find solace in the world of literature and education. He developed a love for history, particularly the stories of great Persian kings such as Cyrus the Great and Darius the Myrn. These figures, who had once ruled vast empires, captured his imagination, filling him with a sense of historical purpose. He began to see himself as a link in the long chain of Persian rulers, destined to restore Iran's past glory. His education was carefully curated to reflect this vision. He was taught about Iran's ancient heritage, its contributions to civilization, and its potential for greatness. At the same time, he was also introduced to Western philosophies and governance, giving him a broad perspective that would later shape his reign. However, as much as he was exposed to these ideas, Mohammad Reza was still a product of his environment, an environment that valued strength above all else. His father's influence loomed large, and even as he developed his own identity, he remained deeply affected by the lessons of his childhood. As he grew older, it became clear that his education would need to extend beyond the confines of Iran. His father, ever the modernizer, recognized that a truly effective leader needed a global perspective. With this in mind, he made a decision that would change the course of Mohammad Reza's life. He would be sent abroad for his education. Thus, in 1931, at the age of 11, Mohammad Reza left Iran for Switzerland, where he would attend the prestigious Institut La Rosey. It was a journey that would take him away from the imposing shadow of his father and expose him to a world unlike anything he had known before. What awaited him in Europe would shape the young crown prince in ways that even his father could not have anticipated. Part 3. Education in Switzerland. A prince in a foreign land. In September 1931, at the age of 11, Crown Prince Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left the comfort and familiarity of Iran for the first time. His destination was Institut La Rose, a prestigious Swiss boarding school known for educating the children of European aristocracy and global elites. His father, Reza Shah Pahlavi, had chosen this institution with a clear purpose in mind: to prepare his son for the modern world, to expose him to Western education, and, above all, to cultivate in him the discipline and resilience necessary to rule a rapidly changing Iran. For Mohammad Reza, the journey to Switzerland was more than just an academic pursuit. It was a defining moment in his life, a separation from his homeland and family that would shape his personality, worldview, and leadership style in the years to come. It was also the first time he was away from the overbearing influence of his father, allowing him to develop an independent identity, though always under the weight of his royal expectations. Arrival at La Rose, the shock of a new world, the transition from Tehran to Switzerland was not easy. Iran, with its deeply traditional society and strong Persian identity, was vastly different from the cosmopolitan and structured world of European boarding schools. Upon his arrival at La Rose, Mohammad Reza was introduced to a rigorous academic program, a regimented daily routine, and a social environment in which he was just another student, not the Crown Prince of Iran. His father had instilled in him a deep sense of self-importance, leading the young prince to believe that he would receive the same deference and respect in Switzerland that he had enjoyed in Iran. However, reality quickly humbled him. On his first day at La Rose, he demanded that his fellow students stand at attention as he walked past them, as was customary among his subordinates back home. His assumption that he would be treated as royalty was swiftly shattered when an American student punched him in response. This incident was a lesson in humility for the young prince, one that forced him to adapt to a world where titles alone did not command respect. Despite this rocky start, Mohammad Reza gradually adjusted to life at La Rose. He found comfort in the structured environment, where discipline and academic excellence were paramount. The school placed a strong emphasis on producing well-rounded individuals, and students were expected to excel not only in their studies, but also in athletics, leadership, and cultural pursuits. Academic and social development. At La Rose, Mohammad Reza was educated primarily in French, the language of diplomacy and high culture, which he would go on to speak fluently for the rest of his life. In addition to Persian, he also learned English and German, ensuring that he would be able to engage with Western leaders and intellectuals on equal footing in the future. The curriculum at La Rose included history, literature, mathematics, science, and philosophy, with a particular emphasis on Western thought and governance. This exposure to European civilization profoundly influenced Mohammad Reza's perspective, deepening his admiration for Western culture and reinforcing his belief in modernization. He developed a strong appreciation for French literature, particularly the works of François-René de Chateaubriand and François Rabelais, which would remain his favorite readings throughout his life. Beyond academics, the school emphasized physical training and sports. Mohammad Reza took up football, horseback riding, and skiing, all of which became lifelong passions. However, records from the school indicate that while he participated in competitive football, his performance was often hindered by timidity, as he was hesitant to take risks on the field. This cautious nature, already visible in his youth, would later manifest in his leadership style as well. Despite his privileged background, Mohammad Reza found himself socially distant from many of his classmates. La Rose was a school for European aristocrats, and while he was technically royalty, he came from a relatively new dynasty that lacked the centuries-old lineage of his peers. This left him feeling somewhat isolated, a feeling that was exacerbated by his reserved personality. One of the few exceptions to this isolation was his friendship with Ernest Perron, a Swiss teacher at La Rose, who would later become one of the most influential figures in his life. Perron, an intellectual with a deep love for poetry and literature, formed a close bond with Mohammad Reza, introducing him to Western philosophy, history, and the finer aspects of European culture. Their friendship would continue long after Mohammad Reza returned to Iran, with Perron accompanying him back to Tehran and remaining at his side for decades. Lessons in leadership and identity. Mohammad Reza's years at Larosi instilled in him a dual identity, one that was both Persian and deeply westernized. On the one hand, he remained loyal to his Iranian heritage, constantly aware of his future responsibilities as crown prince. On the other, he developed an admiration for European modernity, governance, and culture. This would later be reflected in his policies as Shah, as he sought to transform Iran into a modern, westernized state while still preserving its Persian roots. At the same time, his experiences in Switzerland shaped his personal insecurities. Being away from Iran, he was no longer treated as an infallible figure, but rather as an ordinary student. While this experience humbled him, it also made him deeply conscious of his own physical and personal limitations. Compared to his father, who was over 6 feet 4 inches tall and exuded raw strength, Mohammad Reza was of average height and had a far less commanding presence. This awareness of his stature led him to develop an obsession with height and strength, which would later be reflected in his preference for wearing elevator shoes to appear taller and his admiration for towering structures, such as the Damavand Mountain, which he often compared to the peaks of Europe and Japan. Another key takeaway from his time at Larosi was his realization that leadership required more than just brute strength. It demanded intellect, diplomacy, and adaptability. He saw firsthand that European monarchs and leaders were often well-educated and sophisticated, contrasting with the authoritarian rule his father had built in Iran. This exposure planted the seeds of his belief that he would need to balance power with modernization, a struggle that would define his reign. Return to Iran and military training. After 4 years at Larosi, Mohammad Reza returned to Iran in 1936, now a teenager with a broadened perspective on the world. His return was met with both anticipation and pressure. He was no longer just a boy, but the future Shah of Iran, expected to prove himself worthy of the throne. Upon his return, he was immediately enrolled in Tehran's military academy, where he was given a thorough education in military strategy, governance, and Persian history. Reza Shah, who still viewed his son as too soft, insisted on a rigorous military training regimen designed to harden him into a true soldier. Mohammad Reza spent the next 2 years in military education, graduating as a second lieutenant in 1938 before being swiftly promoted to captain. During this period, his relationship with his father remained complex. While Reza Shah was pleased with his son's discipline and education, he continued to see him as lacking the toughness needed for absolute rule. Mohammad Reza, in turn, struggled with living up to his father's expectations, oscillating between admiration for his father's strength and resentment for his harshness. At the same time, he began inspecting the army and infrastructure of Iran, often traveling across the country to assess civil and military installations. These early experiences gave him a first-hand understanding of the nation he was set to rule, exposing him to both the strengths and weaknesses of Iran's governance. Despite his formal military training, Mohammad Reza remained more intellectually inclined than his father. He preferred diplomacy over brute force, an approach that would define his leadership style. However, even as he sought to forge his own path, he could not escape the legacy of his father, a man whose iron-fisted rule had transformed Iran, but also created deep-seated resentment among his people. As the world entered the late 1930s, Iran stood at a crossroads. Mohammad Reza had returned home as a Western-educated, well-mannered prince, but his father's rule remained as authoritarian and rigid as ever. Unknown to both of them, the coming global conflict of World War II would soon force a dramatic shift in the course of Mohammad Reza's life, leading to an abrupt and unexpected ascension to the throne. Part 4. The Anglo-Soviet Invasion and the Unexpected Ascension to the Throne. By the late 1930s, Crown Prince Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had completed his education and military training, returning from Switzerland's Institute Larosi with a broadened worldview. He had also undergone rigorous military instruction at the Tehran Military Academy, emerging as a second lieutenant before quickly being promoted to captain. His return to Iran marked the beginning of his public life, as he was increasingly tasked with duties that introduced him to the realities of governance. However, his father, Reza Shah Pahlavi, remained the unchallenged ruler of Iran, and Mohammad Reza's role was largely ceremonial. Yet the world was changing rapidly. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 altered the balance of power across the globe, and though Iran had declared neutrality, it soon found itself at the center of a geopolitical struggle between the great powers. As the war raged on, Mohammad Reza found himself standing at the crossroads of history, an observer at first, but soon an unwilling participant in the forced abdication of his father and his own unexpected rise to the peacock throne. The storm of war, Iran caught between Britain, the Soviet Union, and Germany. Since assuming the throne in 1925, Reza Shah Pahlavi had embarked on a radical modernization program, transforming Iran into a centralized state with a stronger military and infrastructure. However, his admiration for authoritarian rulers, including Adolf Hitler, and his attempts to reduce British and Soviet influence in Iran made him a target of suspicion for the Allied powers. While Reza Shah had no ideological connection to Nazi Germany, he sought to reduce Iran's reliance on Britain and the Soviet Union, which had long interfered in the country's affairs. To achieve this, he welcomed German engineers, advisors, and businessmen to Iran, using their expertise to develop railways, industry, and military capacity. By 1941, more than 2,000 Germans were working in Iran, particularly in railway construction, a fact that deeply alarmed Britain and the Soviet Union. Both Allied powers feared that Iran's rail network, which connected the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, could be used by Germany to transport troops and supplies. As the war escalated, Britain and the Soviet Union demanded that Iran expel all German nationals. Reza Shah, confident in Iran's neutrality, refused, a decision that would soon cost him his throne. The Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran, August 1941. In the early hours of August 25, 1941, the British and Soviet armies launched a coordinated invasion of Iran. British and Indian forces entered from Iraq, swiftly seizing the oil-rich province of Khuzestan in the south, while Soviet troops stormed into northern Iran from the Caucasus. The invasion took Reza Shah and his son Mohammad Reza completely by surprise. At the time, Iranian forces were ill-prepared to resist an attack by two of the world's strongest military powers. The Iranian army, despite years of modernization, was outmatched in both manpower and weaponry. Within days, British and Soviet forces had overrun the country. Mohammad Reza, then a 22-year-old crown prince, watched in horror as Iran's military collapsed. The rapid defeat was humiliating, not just for Iran, but for his father, who had spent years building the army. Reza Shah, who had always prided himself on his military strength, was furious. When he learned that a group of high-ranking Iranian generals were secretly discussing surrender, he flew into a violent rage, striking one of them and nearly ordering his execution on the spot. Only Mohammad Reza's intervention prevented the general from being killed. Despite his father's fury, it was clear that Iran could not resist the Allied invasion. Tehran was soon surrounded, and on September 17, 1941, British and Soviet forces entered the capital. Under intense pressure, Reza Shah reluctantly agreed to abdicate, believing that by stepping down, he might spare Iran from complete occupation. For Mohammad Reza, this was an unexpected turning point. Until this moment, he had lived in his father's shadow, with little real political power. Now, with the stroke of a pen, he was about to become Shah of Iran. A forced coronation, Mohammad Reza becomes Shah. On September 16, 1941, Prime Minister Mohammad Ali Foroughi convened a special session of the Iranian parliament, Majlis, to formally announce Reza Shah's abdication. With his resignation official, Mohammad Reza was immediately named Shah. The next day at 4:30 p.m., Mohammad Reza Pahlavi took the oath of office before Parliament. In his speech, he vowed to uphold Iran's sovereignty and promised a new era of leadership. However, despite his publicly confident demeanor, he was deeply uncertain about his ability to rule. He had not been prepared for such an abrupt rise to power, and with Iran under foreign occupation, his authority was already compromised. As he left Parliament, crowds filled the streets of Tehran, cheering for the new Shah. Many were simply relieved that Reza Shah's authoritarian rule had ended, while others hoped that Mohammad Reza's Western education would lead to a more liberal government. However, not everyone was pleased. The British had originally hoped to restore a Qajar prince to the throne, but they found that their preferred candidate, Prince Hamid Mirza, did not even speak Persian. Reluctantly, they accepted Mohammad Reza as Shah. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was less concerned with who was on the throne and more interested in maintaining control over northern Iran, where they had stationed their troops. The Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin, saw the invasion of Iran as a strategic move to secure supply routes and expand Soviet influence in the region. As the newly crowned Shah, Mohammad Reza was immediately faced with overwhelming challenges. His father had centralized power so completely that there were few institutions left to guide him. The country was still under military occupation, and both British and Soviet forces had their own agendas for Iran. Despite the ceremonial grandeur of his ascension, Mohammad Reza privately felt powerless. His throne had been granted by foreign powers, not by his own actions. Unlike his father, who had seized power through force and determination, Mohammad Reza had inherited his rule under foreign pressure, a reality that left him feeling deeply insecure. Reza Shah's departure and the end of an era. On September 17, 1941, Reza Shah left Iran under British escort. His first destination was British-controlled Palestine, from where he was later exiled to Mauritius and eventually Johannesburg, South Africa. The once mighty ruler of Iran, who had transformed the country through sheer force of will, now found himself powerless and humiliated in a foreign land. Mohammad Reza never saw his father again. When Reza Shah died in exile in 1944, the young Shah received the news with a mixture of sorrow and relief. His father's death ended an era, one defined by military rule, sweeping reforms, and iron-fisted control. However, it also left Mohammad Reza without a guiding force, forcing him to navigate the complexities of ruling Iran on his own. A new monarch in a changing Iran. At just 22 years old, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was now Shah of Iran. His father's shadow loomed large, and the weight of expectation, history, and foreign interference bore heavily on his shoulders. Iran was still under occupation, its economy was struggling, and its political landscape was uncertain. Would Mohammad Reza follow in his father's footsteps, ruling with an iron hand? Or would he carve out his own path, embracing reform and diplomacy? For now he could only observe, learn, and survive, for his true test as a ruler was yet to come. Part 5, a young Shah in an occupied Iran, struggles for legitimacy and survival. By the autumn of 1941, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was now Shah of Iran, a title he had neither fought for nor expected to assume so soon. At just 22 years old, he found himself at the helm of a nation that was militarily occupied, economically strained, and politically unstable. The forced abdication of his father, Reza Shah Pahlavi, had left an indelible mark on the young monarch, one that instilled in him a deep-seated fear of external forces, a determination to preserve his dynasty, and an intense distrust of political opposition. But Iran was no longer a country ruled by absolute monarchy. British and Soviet forces occupied large portions of the country, and Mohammad Reza was little more than a figurehead, his power limited by foreign interference and a fragile domestic political scene. Could he consolidate his rule and secure Iran's sovereignty? Or was he merely a placeholder for greater powers? This was the challenge that defined the early years of his reign. The challenge of foreign occupation? When British and Soviet forces invaded Iran in August 1941, their primary objective was to secure the Persian corridor, a vital supply route for the Allied war effort against Nazi Germany. Iran's vast oil reserves and strategic location made it indispensable in the global conflict. Despite Mohammad Reza's formal ascension to the throne, his government had little actual power. Both the British and Soviets dictated policy, determining Iran's role in the war. British forces controlled southern Iran, particularly the oil-rich province of Khuzestan, while Soviet troops occupied the north, including Azerbaijan and Kurdistan. The Allies justified their presence as necessary for the war effort, but in reality, both London and Moscow had long-term interests in Iran. The Soviets in particular saw the occupation as an opportunity to expand their influence over Iran's northern provinces, a move that would later cause a major crisis for the young Shah. For the first time, Mohammad Reza saw the limits of Iranian sovereignty. He had little choice but to cooperate with the occupying forces while seeking ways to strengthen his authority behind the scenes. The role of Prime Minister Mohammad Ali Foroughi, one of Mohammad Reza's most important allies in these early years, was Prime Minister Mohammad Ali Foroughi, a respected statesman and scholar. Foroughi had played a critical role in ensuring a smooth transition of power, persuading the British and Soviets to accept Mohammad Reza as the new Shah rather than installing a pro-Allied ruler from the defunct Qajar dynasty. Foroughi, though elderly and suffering from angina, proved to be an indispensable political guide for the young Shah. His diplomatic skills prevented the complete collapse of the Iranian government, and he advised Mohammad Reza on how to navigate the precarious situation. He understood that Iran needed to appear cooperative with the Allies while simultaneously laying the groundwork for future independence. One of Foroughi's first acts as prime minister was to negotiate with the British and Soviets to limit their interference in Iranian domestic affairs. He emphasized Iran's neutrality in the war and secured guarantees that the occupying powers would respect Iran's sovereignty, at least on paper. However, Foroughi's health was deteriorating rapidly, and by 1942 he was forced to step down. His departure left Mohammad Reza without his most trusted political advisor, exposing the young monarch to the chaotic world of Iranian politics. A struggle for control, political factions, and the rising communist threat. With Foroughi gone, Mohammad Reza had to navigate Iran's fractured political landscape largely on his own. The power vacuum left by his father's departure had revitalized political factions, each with competing interests. The conservatives. Many former officials from Reza Shah's government remained in positions of power, loyal to the Pahlavi dynasty, but wary of Mohammad Reza's inexperience. The nationalists, a growing faction of secular Iranian nationalists influenced by Western democratic ideals, sought greater independence from foreign powers. The ulama, religious clergy. Though still cautious, religious leaders, particularly Ayatollah Kashani, began voicing opposition to foreign intervention and monarchical rule. The Tudeh Party. Perhaps the most concerning faction was the Tudeh Party of Iran, a Marxist-Leninist movement that was gaining strength, particularly in Soviet-occupied northern Iran. The Tudeh had strong backing from the Soviet Union and advocated for land reform, labor rights, and an end to monarchy. Mohammad Reza viewed the Tudeh Party as a direct threat to his rule. Communist revolutions had overthrown monarchies in Russia and other parts of the world, and he feared that Iran would be next. However, with Soviet troops still present in northern Iran, he had to be cautious in suppressing their activities. This delicate balancing act would define much of his early reign, appeasing the Soviets while preventing the rise of communism in Iran. Economic hardships and social unrest. The war had devastated Iran's economy. The British and Soviets extracted resources, particularly oil and food supplies, for their own war efforts, leading to severe shortages for the Iranian people. Inflation skyrocketed, and basic goods such as bread and rice became scarce. The economic crisis led to widespread public discontent, particularly in urban areas. Strikes and protests became more frequent, with workers demanding better wages and lower prices. The Tudeh Party capitalized on this unrest, organizing demonstrations and portraying itself as the champion of the working class. For Mohammad Reza, these conditions were alarming. He feared that continued economic hardship would fuel radical movements, weakening his hold on power. But with limited control over the economy or the military, his ability to address these grievances was severely constrained. The Tehran Conference and the Future of Iran. In November 1943, the Tehran Conference brought Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin to the Iranian capital. The presence of these world leaders further highlighted Iran's strategic importance, but also underscored the Shah's limited authority. The main discussions at the conference focused on coordinating military efforts against Nazi Germany. But for Iran, the most significant outcome was a joint declaration by the Allied powers promising to withdraw from Iran after the war. This was a diplomatic victory for Mohammad Reza, but whether the Soviets would honor their commitment remained uncertain. The conference also reinforced Mohammad Reza's distrust of the Soviets. While Churchill and Roosevelt assured him that Iran's sovereignty would be protected, Stalin's expanding influence in northern Iran suggested otherwise. The Shah began to suspect that the Soviets had long-term ambitions in Iran, a fear that would soon be proven right. The post-war struggle. Will the Soviets leave? As World War II neared its end in 1945, Mohammad Reza began to push for the withdrawal of British and Soviet troops. The British, though still influential, were more willing to leave, having secured control over Iran's oil industry. The Soviets, however, had no intention of departing quietly. By 1946, Soviet-backed factions in Iranian Azerbaijan and Kurdistan declared independence, establishing the Azerbaijan People's Government and the Republic of Mohammad. These separatist movements, openly supported by the Red Army, posed a direct challenge to Mohammad Reza's rule. The crisis escalated into an international conflict, bringing Iran before the United Nations for the first time. The young Shah, desperate to preserve Iran's territorial integrity, had to rely on diplomacy and American support to force the Soviets to withdraw. Would he succeed, or was Iran doomed to become a Soviet satellite state? The making of a monarch. By the mid-1940s, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was no longer just a ceremonial ruler. Through years of navigating foreign occupation, economic crises, and political intrigue, he had developed into a calculating and determined monarch. He was no longer the timid young prince overshadowed by his father, but a man determined to consolidate his power and protect Iran's sovereignty. However, as he prepared to confront the Soviet threat, he faced another challenge: how to rule Iran without becoming a puppet of foreign powers. Would he succeed in establishing his own independent rule? Or would the Cold War's influence dictate Iran's fate? Part 6. Confronting the Cold War. The crisis in northern Iran and the battle for sovereignty. By the end of World War II, the young Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, found himself at the center of a new geopolitical struggle, the emerging Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. With the Allied forces having promised to withdraw from Iran after the war, Mohammad Reza hoped to establish full sovereignty over his country. However, as 1945 turned into 1946, it became clear that the Soviets had other intentions. The situation in northern Iran was tense and precarious. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, was reluctant to relinquish control over the strategic territories they had occupied during the war. This led to a major crisis that would ultimately define Mohammad Reza's early reign: his battle to preserve Iran's territorial integrity in the face of foreign ambitions. Would Iran become a pawn in the expanding Soviet sphere of influence? Or could Mohammad Reza assert independence and secure the country's unity? Soviet ambitions in northern Iran, the rise of separatist movements. The roots of the crisis lay in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Despite the Allied promise to withdraw troops from Iran, the Red Army remained stationed in Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, two key regions in northern Iran. Taking advantage of the military occupation, the Soviets began fomenting local uprisings and supporting the establishment of separatist regimes. In November 1945, Soviet-backed factions declared the formation of the Azerbaijan People's Government, a semi-autonomous entity led by Jafar Pishavari, a longtime communist activist. The Red Army provided military protection and political support, effectively cutting off the region from the central government in Tehran. Shortly thereafter, a similar movement in Kurdistan proclaimed the creation of the Republic of Mohammad, also under Soviet protection. For Mohammad Reza, these developments were a direct challenge to his rule. Iran's territorial integrity was at stake, and the Shah feared that if these separatist movements were allowed to succeed, they would pave the way for Soviet domination over the entire country. However, the Iranian army was still recovering from the effects of occupation. and direct military action was not an immediate option. The Shah had to find a way to address the crisis through diplomacy and international support. The Iranian crisis of 1946, confrontation at the United Nations. The crisis quickly escalated into a major international confrontation. With Soviet troops refusing to leave northern Iran, the issue was brought before the newly established United Nations, UN, a historic moment as it was one of the first major disputes to be addressed by the UN Security Council. In early 1946, the Shah's government, with support from the United States and Britain, accused the Soviet Union of violating Iran's sovereignty by occupying Iranian territory and supporting separatist movements. The UN Security Council convened to address the crisis, and Iran became a central topic of discussion. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi saw this as a critical opportunity to rally international support against the Soviet occupation and preserve his country's independence. U.S. President Harry S. Truman took a strong stand against the Soviets, viewing the situation in Iran as a test of Soviet intentions in the post-war world. He pressured Stalin to withdraw, signaling that the United States would not tolerate Soviet expansion into Iran. This diplomatic backing was crucial for the young Shah, who relied heavily on American support to counterbalance Soviet influence. The pressure from the United States, combined with mounting international scrutiny at the United Nations, eventually forced Stalin's hand. In May 1946, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its troops from Iran, and the separatist governments in Azerbaijan and Kurdistan were left without their primary support. This was seen as a significant diplomatic victory for Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and a key moment in the early Cold War. However, the crisis had exposed Iran's vulnerability and the complexities of navigating international politics in an era of superpower rivalry. Although the Shah had managed to secure the reunification of Iran, the threat of Soviet interference had not disappeared entirely. Restoring authority, the collapse of separatist movements. With the withdrawal of Soviet forces, Mohammad Reza was determined to reassert Iranian authority over the rebellious provinces. In December 1946, Iranian troops, led personally by the Shah, entered Azerbaijan and Kurdistan. The Azerbaijan People's Government in the Republic of Mahabad collapsed rapidly as local support dwindled without Soviet backing. This campaign was significant for Mohammad Reza. It marked the first time he had taken direct command of military operations, and his personal involvement in the effort to restore national sovereignty helped to strengthen his image as a leader capable of defending Iran's interests. The successful reoccupation of the northern provinces was celebrated as a major national triumph. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was praised for his role in safeguarding Iran's territorial integrity and resisting foreign aggression. For a young Shah who had previously been seen as weak and inexperienced, this was an important step toward consolidating his position as a legitimate ruler. However, the crisis also left lasting scars. The two-day party, which had been involved in the separatist movements, continued to operate in Iran, and the experience deepened the Shah's mistrust of communism and left-wing politics. This animosity would shape much of his domestic policy in the years to come, as he sought to suppress communist influence and align Iran more closely with the West. Emerging tensions with the Soviets. A new phase in the Cold War. Although the immediate crisis had been resolved, the Shah's relationship with the Soviet Union remained tense. Mohammad Reza viewed the events in Azerbaijan and Kurdistan as evidence of the Soviet Union's ambitions in Iran, and he became increasingly suspicious of Soviet intentions. The 1946 crisis marked the beginning of Iran's alignment with the Western Bloc in the emerging Cold War. The Shah understood that, to safeguard Iran's independence, he needed the support of the United States and other Western powers. This realization led to a significant shift in Iran's foreign policy, with Mohammad Reza actively seeking closer ties with Washington and distancing Iran from Soviet influence. To bolster his military capabilities and secure his reign, the Shah embarked on a policy of modernizing the Iranian armed forces. He sought Western military aid and training, particularly from the United States, to build a force capable of defending Iran against external threats. This strategy, however, also made him increasingly dependent on Western support, a dependency that would later have significant implications for his rule. Domestic challenges. The rise of political opposition. While the crisis in northern Iran was unfolding, the Shah faced significant domestic challenges. Iran was still recovering from the devastation of World War II, and the country's economy was struggling with food shortages, inflation, and unemployment. Social discontent was growing, and the Tudeh party, though weakened by the failure of the separatist movements, continued to be a major political force. Mohammad Reza's authority was still fragile. Many in Iran saw him as a reluctant monarch, installed under foreign pressure rather than by popular will. His initial approach to governance was cautious, marked by a desire to avoid confrontation with powerful political factions. However, as he grew more confident in his position, the Shah began to assert greater control over Iranian politics. One of his primary goals was to curtail the influence of the Tudeh party, which he viewed as a threat to his monarchy. The party's ties to the Soviet Union made it a convenient target in the context of the Cold War, and the Shah used anti-communist rhetoric to justify his actions. He expanded the powers of Iran's security services, including the newly established secret police, which would later become known as SAVAK. Yet while the Shah sought to strengthen his grip on power, he was also aware of the need to reform the country. Iran's social and economic problems could not be ignored, and Mohammad Reza knew that his rule would be judged not just by his ability to resist foreign aggression, but by his capacity to improve the lives of ordinary Iranians. The lessons of 1946, a turning point in Mohammad Reza's reign. The events of 1946 profoundly shaped Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's approach to both domestic and foreign policy. The struggle to preserve Iran's sovereignty against Soviet ambitions reinforced his belief in the importance of military strength and Western alliances. At the same time, the economic challenges facing the country pushed him to consider the need for reform and modernization. The crisis also exposed the complex realities of ruling a country caught between competing superpowers. Although the Shah had succeeded in preventing Iran from falling under Soviet control, he understood that his position remained precarious. To maintain stability, he would have to carefully navigate the demands of foreign powers, political factions, and the Iranian people. As he looked to the future, Mohammad Reza was determined to build a stronger Iran, an Iran that could stand on its own in the turbulent world of the Cold War. But how would he achieve this vision? And what challenges would he face along the way? Part 7. Consolidating Power. The Struggle for Political Control and the Road to Absolute Rule. By the late 1940s, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had managed to preserve Iran's territorial integrity in the face of Soviet-backed separatist movements. However, he was still a weak monarch, his power constrained by a fragile political system, a turbulent parliament, and lingering foreign influence. The Shah's position was far from secure. Although he had successfully restored Iranian sovereignty, his control over internal affairs remained limited. The political elite of Iran, including the Majlis, parliament, nationalist leaders, and conservative clerics, still held considerable influence. He found himself constantly balancing competing factions, all while dealing with economic instability and rising political opposition. By the early 1950s, however, Mohammad Reza had grown more determined to assert his authority. He had learned from his father's mistakes. Unlike Reza Shah, who had ruled with brute force, Mohammad Reza sought to undermine his opponents through political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and, when necessary, repression. Would he succeed in transforming himself from a weak constitutional monarch into an absolute ruler? Or would he once again be forced to bow to the forces of Iranian politics? The rise of nationalist movements and the oil crisis. Iran's political landscape in the late 1940s and early 1950s was dominated by nationalist movements, many of which sought greater independence from foreign powers, particularly Britain. At the center of these movements was Mohammad Mossadegh, a veteran politician and nationalist leader who had become a powerful figure in Iranian politics. Mossadegh and his supporters viewed Iran's oil industry, which was still controlled by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, as a symbol of foreign exploitation. For decades, Iran's vast oil wealth had benefited Britain far more than Iran itself, with Iranian oil revenues disproportionately favoring the British government and the company's shareholders rather than the Iranian people. By 1951, nationalist pressure had reached a boiling point. The Majlis, led by Mossadegh and his National Front coalition, passed a bill calling for the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. This bold move set Iran on a collision course with Britain, which vehemently opposed the loss of its lucrative oil interests. It also placed Mohammad Reza in a difficult position. Would he support the nationalists and challenge Britain, or would he try to maintain relations with the West? Under intense pressure from Mossadegh and the Majlis, Mohammad Reza had little choice but to reluctantly sign the bill into law. The decision made Mossadegh a national hero, but it also triggered an economic and political crisis that would ultimately lead to a major confrontation between the Shah and the Prime Minister. The power struggle between the Shah and Mossadegh. With the oil nationalization crisis dominating Iranian politics, Mossadegh was appointed Prime Minister in April 1951. His tenure was immediately contentious. He sought to curb the Shah's authority, limit the monarchy's influence in government, and push for further democratic reforms. Their relationship became increasingly strained, as Mossadegh sought to reduce the Shah's role to that of a symbolic figurehead, much like constitutional monarchs in Britain or Sweden. The conflict between the Shah and Mossadegh soon became a battle over who would truly govern Iran. While the Shah enjoyed the support of the military, the aristocracy, and the conservative clergy, Mossadegh had widespread popular support, particularly among the middle class, students, and secular nationalists. For the first time in his reign, Mohammad Reza faced the real possibility of being overshadowed or even deposed by a prime minister. The British blockade and economic collapse. In retaliation for Iran's nationalization of its oil industry, Britain imposed a global boycott of Iranian oil exports, effectively crippling Iran's economy. The British also withdrew their oil technicians, leaving Iran struggling to maintain production. With oil revenues plummeting and the economy spiraling into crisis, Mossadegh's government found itself increasingly isolated. Britain, unwilling to accept the loss of its oil assets, lobbied the United States for support in removing Mossadegh from power. At first, the U.S. government, under President Harry Truman, was reluctant to intervene. Truman was sympathetic to Iranian nationalism and saw Mossadegh as a legitimate leader. However, after Dwight D. Eisenhower became president in 1953, the U.S. position shifted dramatically. Eisenhower and his administration saw Mossadegh as a potential threat, fearing that his nationalist movement could push Iran closer to the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1953, the British and American intelligence agencies, MI6 and the CIA, had developed a plan to overthrow Mossadegh and restore the Shah's full authority. The 1953 coup, Operation Ajax. On August 15, 1953, the CIA-backed coup known as Operation Ajax was set in motion. The plan, orchestrated by CIA officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr., aimed to remove Mossadegh from power and reinstate the Shah as an absolute ruler. However, the initial coup attempt failed. Mossadegh, suspecting a plot, ordered the arrest of military officers involved in the operation. As news of the coup attempt spread, mass protests erupted in Tehran, with crowds supporting Mossadegh and denouncing the Shah. Fearing for his life, Mohammad Reza fled Iran on August 16, 1953, boarding a plane to Baghdad and later traveling to Rome. The Shah's departure marked a low point in his reign. It seemed as though he had lost the battle for power. But the CIA was not finished yet. With the backing of royalist factions in the military, the coup was relaunched on August 19, 1953. This time, the Shah's supporters successfully mobilized. With CIA funding, royalist forces and street mobs took control of key government buildings, and Mossadegh's forces were overwhelmed. By the evening of August 19th, the coup had succeeded. Mossadegh was arrested, and the Shah's authority was restored. Mohammad Reza returned to Tehran on August 22, 1953, now determined to eliminate any challenge to his rule. Aftermath of the coup. The Shah's transformation, the fall of Mossadegh, marked a turning point in Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's reign. He had faced exile and humiliation, but he returned to power with a new determination. The coup had radically altered the political landscape of Iran. The Shah emerged as the undisputed leader of Iran. No longer just a constitutional monarch, he now had full control over the government. The Tudeh Party and National Front were severely repressed, with opposition figures imprisoned or exiled. Iran's military and intelligence services were strengthened, leading to the creation of SAVAK, the notorious secret police. The oil industry was reopened, but under a new agreement that gave the U.S. a larger share of Iranian oil revenues. The 1953 coup had also cemented Mohammad Reza's alliance with the United States, ensuring decades of American support for his rule. However, the way in which he consolidated power through a foreign-backed coup left a lasting stain on his legitimacy. Many Iranians viewed him as a Western puppet, an image that would fuel future resentment in revolutionary movements. The Shah's new era of rule. After 1953, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi transformed from a weak ruler into an authoritarian monarch. He had learned that power was not given, it had to be taken. But with absolute rule came new responsibilities and new enemies. Would he use his power to modernize Iran, or would his authoritarian tendencies set the stage for his eventual downfall? Part 8. The Shah's modernization drive, the White Revolution in the pursuit of power. By the mid-1950s, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had finally established himself as Iran's undisputed ruler. The 1953 coup had eliminated his most powerful political opponent, Mohammad Mossadegh, and secured the backing of the United States, ensuring that his rule would be unchallenged for the foreseeable future. Yet while the coup had strengthened his grip on power, it had also left a deep scar on Iranian society. The resentment caused by foreign interference, particularly American and British involvement, would linger beneath the surface. Determined to prove that his rule was not just the result of a foreign-backed coup, the Shah embarked on an ambitious modernization campaign that he hoped would transform Iran into a modern, powerful state. This effort, later known as the White Revolution, would define the next phase of his reign. But could the Shah successfully modernize Iran without addressing the deep-seated political grievances that had fueled previous uprisings? Or was he simply laying the groundwork for future unrest? Building an autocracy, the strengthening of the Shah's power. With Mossadegh out of the picture, Mohammad Reza wasted no time in consolidating his authority. He moved swiftly to crush opposition, particularly targeting the Tudeh Party, Iran's communist movement, which had played a significant role in the nationalist struggle. The Tudeh Party's leadership was dismantled. Many of its members were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The military was expanded and modernized, ensuring that the Shah had a loyal force at his disposal. The secret police, SAVAK, was created in 1957 with the help of the CIA and Mossad to monitor, infiltrate, and eliminate potential threats to his rule. With a strong security apparatus in place, Mohammad Reza was able to rule with an iron grip, ensuring that political dissent remained strictly controlled. But military strength and repression were not enough. The Shah wanted more than just to rule Iran. He wanted to be seen as a great reformer, a leader who would bring economic prosperity, social progress, and global recognition to his nation. The answer, he believed, lay in economic modernization and social transformation. The White Revolution, a bold experiment in reform. In 1963, the Shah introduced a sweeping series of reforms known as the White Revolution. This ambitious program aimed to modernize Iran's economy and society while weakening traditional power structures, particularly the landowning elite and the religious establishment. The main components of the White Revolution included land reform. Large estates owned by feudal landlords were broken up, and land was redistributed to small farmers. This was intended to weaken the aristocracy and create a new class of independent farmers loyal to the Shah. Women's rights. Women were granted the right to vote and were encouraged to enter the workforce and higher education. This was a radical shift in a deeply patriarchal society. Educational expansion. A national literacy program was launched to reduce illiteracy, particularly in rural areas. The Literacy Corps was established, sending young educated Iranians into villages to teach. Health and infrastructure development. Large-scale investments were made in roads, hospitals, and sanitation, aimed at improving the standard of living across the country. Industrial growth and economic modernization. The Shah sought to diversify the economy beyond oil, investing in manufacturing, steel production, and other industries. He also invited foreign businesses to invest in Iran, hoping to accelerate industrialization. Nationalization of forests and natural resources, aimed at environmental conservation and limiting exploitation by wealthy landowners. On paper, these reforms were progressive and transformative, bringing Iran closer to Western standards of development. The Shah viewed himself as a modernizer, comparing his efforts to those of Ataturk in Turkey. But despite the economic progress, the White Revolution had serious unintended consequences. Resistance to reform, the clergy, and the backlash. The White Revolution was deeply unpopular among traditionalists, particularly the clergy, who saw it as a direct attack on Islamic values and their influence over society. One of the most vocal critics of the Shah's reforms was a little-known cleric from Qom, Ruhollah Khomeini. Khomeini opposed the land reforms, arguing that they weakened religious endowments, waqf, which provided funding for Islamic schools and institutions. He denounced women's suffrage, claiming it was an attack on Islamic principles. He criticized the Shah's close ties with the United States, warning that Iran was becoming a puppet of Western powers. In June 1963, Khomeini delivered a fiery sermon, accusing the Shah of being a tyrant who was leading Iran towards moral and cultural ruin. His speech sparked nationwide protests, particularly in religious cities like Qom, Mashhad, and Isfahan. The Shah's response was swift and brutal. Khomeini was arrested and exiled, first to Turkey and later to Iraq, where he would continue his anti-Shah campaign. Protests were violently crushed, with hundreds of demonstrators killed by the Shah's security forces. While the Shah successfully suppressed the uprising, Khomeini's defiance made him a symbol of resistance, particularly among conservative and religious Iranians. This would prove to be a pivotal moment. Though the Shah dismissed Khomeini at the time, the exiled cleric would one day return as his greatest adversary. Economic growth versus political repression. Despite the opposition from the clergy, the White Revolution did achieve some economic success. Urbanization increased rapidly, with millions of rural Iranians migrating to Tehran, Shiraz, and other major cities in search of jobs. Iran's economy boomed, fueled by oil revenues and foreign investment. Infrastructure projects modernized the country, with new roads, dams, and factories being built. However, economic development was uneven. Wealth inequality grew, as rural poverty persisted while the elite became richer. Inflation and corruption created resentment among middle-class Iranians. Many traditional merchants, Bazari, who had once been the backbone of Iran's economy, felt marginalized by foreign competition. At the same time, political freedoms were being crushed. All opposition parties were banned. The press was heavily censored. Dissent was ruthlessly suppressed by SAVAK, which used arrests, torture, and executions to silence critics. The Shah's growing personality cult. As the White Revolution progressed, Mohammad Reza began to see himself as a near-messianic figure. He declared that Iran was experiencing a great civilization, and that under his leadership, it would soon rival Europe and the United States in terms of development. He cultivated a personality cult, presenting himself as the guardian of Iran's destiny. His image adorned schools, government offices, and public buildings. State-controlled media constantly praised his leadership. But behind the facade of supreme confidence, the Shah was increasingly paranoid. He feared that foreign conspiracies, whether from the Soviets, the British, or Islamic radicals, were seeking to undermine his rule. His growing obsession with security led him to expand SAVAK's powers, making Iran one of the most repressive states in the Middle East. A nation in transformation. By the late 1960s, Mohammad Reza had dramatically reshaped Iran. The White Revolution had brought modernization, economic growth, and social change, but at the cost of political repression and rising discontent. Iran was no longer a backward, feudal society, but it was also not a stable democracy. Beneath the glittering surface of prosperity, tensions were building. Would the Shah recognize the warning signs and adjust his rule? Or was he unknowingly paving the way for his eventual downfall? Part 9. The Apex of Power and the Seeds of Unrest. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had reached the height of his power. Iran was experiencing unprecedented economic growth, fueled by rising oil revenues and the Shah's ambitious modernization policies. The country had transformed from a feudal economy into an emerging industrial power, and the Shah styled himself as the architect of a great civilization that would rival the world's most advanced nations. But beneath the surface of success, trouble was brewing. The opposition was growing, despite the Shah's repressive measures. The gap between rich and poor widened, creating resentment among the working class. The clergy, particularly the exiled Ruhollah Khomeini, continued to criticize the Shah's policies. Could the Shah maintain his grip on power, or would his overconfidence and harsh methods of control ultimately lead to his downfall? Iran, though not part of the embargo, took advantage of the situation by raising oil prices dramatically. The result was an economic windfall, with Iran's oil revenues skyrocketing from $4 billion in 1972 to over $20 billion in 1976. Flush with newfound wealth, the Shah accelerated his modernization drive. Massive infrastructure projects were launched, including new highways, airports, and industrial centers. The military was heavily expanded, making Iran one of the strongest armed forces in the Middle East. Education and healthcare were further expanded, with new universities and hospitals being built across the country. Iran's economy was booming, and the Shah believed that he was on the verge of making Iran a global superpower. But was this success sustainable? The Shah's increasing authoritarianism. With his economic power at its peak, Mohammad Reza became increasingly autocratic. He viewed himself as Iran's savior, the only leader capable of modernizing the nation and protecting it from foreign enemies. His personality cult reached new heights. His portraits were displayed everywhere, from schools to government buildings. He claimed to be the successor of Cyrus the Great, connecting his rule to Iran's ancient glory. The media glorified his achievements, portraying him as an enlightened ruler leading Iran into prosperity. But at the same time, he suppressed all political opposition. All political parties were banned, and Iran became a one-party state under the Rostakis Party in 1975. SAVAK's power grew, with thousands of political opponents arrested, tortured, or executed. The Majlis Parliament became a rubber-stamp institution with no real power. Even former allies began to question his rule. Many Iranians resented his heavy-handed tactics, and his critics, whether nationalists, Islamists, communists, or liberals, began to find common ground in their opposition to him. Tensions with the clergy and Khomeini's growing influence. One of the Shah's most significant enemies was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Exiled since 1964, Khomeini had continued to denounce the Shah from Iraq and later France. He accused the Shah of being a Western puppet, promoting un-Islamic policies and oppressing the Iranian people. Khomeini's sermons, smuggled into Iran via cassette tapes, gained a growing following among the disillusioned masses. While the Shah dismissed Khomeini as a minor threat, the exiled cleric was slowly building a revolutionary movement that would soon challenge the very foundation of the Pahlavi dynasty. The 2,500-year celebration of the Persian Empire, 1971. One of the most extravagant events of the Shah's reign was the 2,500-year celebration of the Persian Empire in 1971. The event, held at Persepolis, was meant to showcase Iran's greatness to the world. Lavish banquets were held, with foreign dignitaries from over 60 countries attending. The Shah declared Iran to be one of the greatest civilizations in history, boasting that it would soon surpass Europe in development. However, the celebration backfired in many ways. It was seen as wasteful and excessive, costing hundreds of millions of dollars while millions of Iranians lived in poverty. The clergy denounced it as un-Islamic, further alienating religious conservatives. Many Iranians saw it as evidence of the Shah's detachment from reality, as he focused on grand spectacles instead of solving real issues. The extravagant celebrations only widened the gap between the ruling elite and the common people. The growing resentment against the Shah. Despite economic progress, many Iranians felt left behind. Wealth disparity. While the elite enjoyed luxury, many workers and peasants struggled. Corruption. Government officials and members of the royal family were accused of embezzlement and bribery. Westernization versus tradition. Many felt that the Shah was imposing Western culture, eroding Iran's Islamic identity. Political oppression. Even those who supported modernization resented the lack of political freedoms. Protests began to emerge, particularly among students, intellectuals, and the working class. The Shah, however, refused to acknowledge the growing unrest. He remained convinced that his policies were leading Iran toward a glorious future. But was it too late to change course? Foreign relations. The Shah's role on the global stage. By the 1970s, Iran had become a major regional power. The Shah had strong relations with the United States, positioning Iran as a key ally in the Cold War. He sought to modernize Iran's military, spending billions on US and European weaponry. He positioned himself as the guardian of the Persian Gulf, even challenging Arab leaders like Saddam Hussein. However, his ambitions worried some of his Western allies. The United States began to worry that the Shah's military expansion was making him too independent. His rise in oil prices angered American and European leaders who saw Iran as becoming too powerful economically. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf nations resented his dominance in OPEC. Though he saw himself as a global leader, the Shah's aggressive policies were starting to alienate both friends and enemies. A nation on the brink. By the mid-1970s, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi stood at the pinnacle of power. Iran was rich, modernizing, and militarily strong. The Shah was internationally respected, controlling one of the most strategic nations in the world. He truly believed that Iran was on the verge of greatness, but the signs of trouble were everywhere. The people were restless. The opposition was growing. The economy was overheating. Would the Shah recognize the danger and change his course? Or would his overconfidence and stubbornness push Iran toward revolution? The answer would soon become clear. Part 10, The Unraveling of a Regime, in 1977-1978. By the mid-1970s, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was at the height of his power. Iran had become a regional superpower, boasting a rapidly growing economy, a modernizing society, and one of the best-equipped militaries in the world. The Shah, often referring to himself as the King of Kings, envisioned Iran as a global power capable of rivaling European nations. However, beneath this grand vision, dissatisfaction was boiling over. The Shah's uncompromising rule, his extravagant spending, and the repression of political opposition had alienated many Iranians. By 1977, cracks in the regime had become too deep to ignore, setting the stage for a revolutionary storm. While Tehran's elite enjoyed lavish lifestyles, much of the population struggled with rising inflation and job insecurity. Corruption, government officials, royal family members, and the Shah's inner circle were accused of embezzling billions of dollars. Public trust in the monarchy eroded as corruption scandals multiplied. Repression. The secret police, SAVAK, had grown increasingly ruthless, silencing critics through arrests, torture, and disappearances. Even moderate opposition figures were branded as enemies of the state. Westernization backlash. The Shah's secular and pro-Western policies alienated religious conservatives. Many believed that Iran's Islamic and cultural traditions were being eroded under his rule. Although Iran was more modern than ever, There was a growing sense of resentment among students, workers, intellectuals, and religious leaders. The role of Jimmy Carter in human rights pressure. The election of U.S. President Jimmy Carter in 1976 introduced a new challenge for the Shah. Carter's administration prioritized human rights, urging authoritarian allies, including Iran, to ease political repression. Under U.S. pressure, the Shah loosened restrictions on the press and opposition groups. Political dissidents were released from prison, and some exiled figures were allowed to return. Newspapers began openly criticizing the monarchy, something that had been unthinkable just a few years earlier. While these reforms were meant to appease Western critics, they emboldened opposition groups who seized the opportunity to organize protests. The Shah was now trapped in a paradox. If he continued his repression, he risked losing U.S. support. But if he allowed more political freedoms, he empowered the very forces that sought his overthrow. Khomeini's shadow, the rise of religious opposition. Among the Shah's most formidable opponents was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, an exiled cleric who had been living in Najaf, Iraq, since 1964. Khomeini had long opposed the Shah's secularization policies, calling him a Western puppet. Throughout the 1970s, his messages were smuggled into Iran via cassette tapes, where they were circulated among students and clerics. His influence grew tremendously as he positioned himself as the leader of a broad-based opposition movement. For years, the Shah had dismissed Khomeini as a minor nuisance. But by 1977, the exiled cleric had become the most recognizable figure of resistance against the monarchy. The beginning of the end, 1978, and the cycle of protests. The spark that ignited the revolution came in January 1978, when a government-run newspaper published an article attacking Khomeini. The piece accused Khomeini of being a British agent, a drug addict, a corrupt cleric. The reaction was immediate and violent. On January 9, 1978, students and religious scholars in Qom, one of Iran's most important religious cities, staged mass protests. SAVAK and security forces opened fire, killing dozens. The government attempted to suppress news of the massacre, but word quickly spread across the country. This event triggered a cycle of protests that would repeat every 40 days, a sacred mourning tradition in Shah Islam. Each time martyrs were commemorated, new protests erupted, leading to more deaths at the hands of security forces. Cities like Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, and Mashhad saw mass demonstrations, with protesters calling for an end to the monarchy. For the first time, the Shah faced an organized and unstoppable revolutionary movement. September 8, 1978, Black Friday. By September 1978, the situation had spiraled out of control. The Shah, now desperate, declared martial law and ordered the military to crush the protests. On September 8, 1978, tens of thousands of demonstrators gathered in Jelay Square in Tehran. Security forces opened fire on the crowd, killing at least 100 people. Some reports say over 200. The massacre, later known as Black Friday, was a turning point. It shattered any hope for reconciliation. Instead of intimidating the opposition, the violence radicalized the revolutionaries. After Black Friday, support for the Shah collapsed. Many who had once backed the monarchy now turned against it. The military begins to falter. For decades, the Shah had relied on the loyalty of the military. But by late 1978, signs of cracks within the armed forces began to emerge. Many soldiers and officers sympathized with the revolutionaries. Desertions increased, with some military units refusing to fire on protesters. The Shah's most trusted generals warned him that the army was on the verge of breaking apart. Without the full backing of the military, the Shah's rule was now hanging by a thread. The Shah's desperate attempts to hold on. Realizing that force alone would not save his regime, the Shah made a final attempt at political reforms. He fired Prime Minister Jafar Sharif Imami and replaced him with General Gholam Reza Azari, hoping a military-led government could restore order. He released more political prisoners, including some opposition leaders, to calm the protesters. He promised free elections and pledged to crack down on corruption, but it was too late. The people no longer trusted the Shah. The opposition had grown too powerful. The military was no longer fully loyal. The once mighty peacock throne was collapsing. A king on the brink. By the end of 1978, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi faced an impossible situation. His military was crumbling. His Western allies were distancing themselves. His people were united against him. For the first time, he realized that his reign was nearing its end. Would he fight to keep power, or would he accept defeat and flee? Part 11. The Shah's final struggles in departure from Iran, late 1978, January 1979. By late 1978, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was a monarch in crisis. His once unshakable rule had collapsed under the weight of mass protests, economic turmoil, and military discontent. The streets of Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, and Mashhad were filled with millions of demonstrators demanding an end to the monarchy. The Shah's options were dwindling. His military was divided and unable to suppress the revolution. His Western allies were distancing themselves, unwilling to intervene. His people no longer feared him, emboldened by months of protests. For the first time in his nearly four-decade reign, the Shah was powerless. The question was no longer if he would fall, but when. A desperate search for solutions. As Iran burned with anger and revolt, Mohammad Reza attempted every possible solution to hold on to power. 1. Bringing in a military government, November 1978. Believing that only military rule could restore order, the Shah appointed General Gholam Reza Ajari as Prime Minister in early November 1978. Martial law was expanded, and military tanks and troops flooded the streets. The Shah hoped that the threat of force would frighten protesters into submission. However, the Iranian military was no longer fully loyal. Many soldiers and officers refused to attack civilians. Instead of restoring stability, Ajari's government only deepened the crisis. On December 2, 1978, an estimated 6 to 9 million Iranians, 1 out of every 5 people in the country, marched in anti-Shah demonstrations. The largest protest was held in Tehran, where millions chanted "Death to the Shah." The United States and Britain advised Mohammad Reza to seek a political solution, not military force. Ajari suffered a heart attack in December 1978, and the Shah had no choice but to replace him with a civilian government. 2. Turning to the National Front for help, December 1978, January 1979. As his military failed to contain the revolution, the Shah turned to opposition figures in the hopes of forming a coalition government. He asked former prime ministers and opposition leaders to form a new government. Shapur Bakhtiar, a senior member of the National Front, agreed to become Iran's prime minister, but only under one condition: the Shah must leave Iran. With no other choice, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi agreed to step away from power temporarily and leave the country. But deep down, he knew the truth. If he left Iran, he would never return as king. The final days in Tehran, in the first weeks of January 1979, Iran descended into chaos. The military was collapsing, with desertions reaching critical levels. The revolutionaries were emboldened, taking over government buildings and military bases. The Shah was mentally and physically drained, suffering from cancer, exhaustion, and despair. His once loyal allies had turned their backs on him. The United States, President Jimmy Carter, had stopped supporting him, focusing on negotiations with opposition leaders. The British ambassador Sir Anthony Parsons told him that it was too late to save the monarchy. His generals, some of his most trusted officers, secretly contacted the opposition, hoping to secure their own safety. Even his wife, Empress Farah, tried to convince him to stay and fight, but the Shah had already given up. In a final meeting with his advisors, he fought back tears as he announced, "I can no longer serve you. I am leaving." The Shah departs January 16, 1979. On the morning of January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and Empress Farah arrived at Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. A crowd of royalists, government officials, and military officers gathered to bid farewell. His generals lined up, some crying, others stone-faced, knowing they had failed to save the monarchy. As he stepped onto the plane, he turned to his remaining supporters and said, "I will return." But deep inside, he knew he would never see Iran again. A nation in celebration, as the Shah's plane took off, news spread across Iran that the king was gone. Millions flooded the streets chanting, "The Shah is gone." People hugged, cried, and danced, celebrating what they saw as the end of dictatorship. Images of the Shah were torn down. Statues of him were smashed. For the first time in over 2,500 years, Iran no longer had a king. Exile begins. A king without a home. The Shah believed that he would be welcomed as an honored guest in other countries. First, he flew to Egypt, where President Anwar Sadat warmly received him. Then to Morocco, where he was hosted by King Hassan II. Then to the Bahamas, where he hoped to rest and recover. But as the Islamic Revolution solidified its power, countries that once supported him now rejected him. The United States, his strongest ally, refused to give him asylum. Britain, which had helped put his father on the throne, denied him entry. Even Mexico, where he sought refuge, later forced him to leave under pressure from Iran's new government. The once most powerful man in Iran had become a political outcast, wandering from country to country, begging for a place to stay. The return of Khomeini, February 1st, 1979. With the Shah gone, the opposition quickly took control. Shapur Bakhtiar, the Shah's last prime minister, tried to maintain order, but his government was ignored. The Iranian military collapsed as soldiers refused to fight for a king who had abandoned them. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, now the undisputed leader of the revolution, prepared to return to Iran. On February 1st, 1979, Khomeini's plane landed in Tehran, greeted by millions of supporters. He declared the monarchy dead. He ordered the creation of an Islamic republic. He called for the punishment of the Shah's supporters. The Pahlavi dynasty, which had ruled Iran since 1925, was officially over. The end of an era. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had once dreamed of making Iran a superpower. He built a modern economy. He strengthened Iran's military. He gave women more rights. But in the end, his downfall was swift. His autocratic rule turned people against him. His corruption alienated even his supporters. His failure to listen to his people led to his downfall. From the peacock throne, he had ruled with absolute power. Now he was a king without a country, his future uncertain. What's next? Part 12. The Shah's final exile and desperate search for asylum, 1979 to 1980. With his departure from Iran on January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became a king without a country. The once powerful and feared monarch of the Middle East was now a desperate fugitive, traveling from nation to nation, begging for a place to stay. For decades, he had been one of the most influential rulers in the region, admired by Western leaders and Middle Eastern allies alike. But now, one by one, those same allies abandoned him, each unwilling to bear the burden of sheltering the exiled monarch. As the Shah's health deteriorated, he found himself trapped in a lonely and humiliating exile, haunted by the collapse of his empire and the betrayal of his former friends. This is the story of his final journey, a journey that took him across 3 continents, where he was rejected, humiliated, and ultimately left to die alone. From king to outcast, the search for refuge. As he boarded his plane in Tehran, the Shah believed he would be welcomed as an honored guest in many countries. He had Western allies who once depended on Iran's oil. He had Middle Eastern friends who owed him for his political support. He had billions in personal wealth, which he thought would ensure his comfort. But he would soon discover that nobody wanted him. Egypt, a warm welcome, but only temporary. The Shah's first stop was Egypt, where he was welcomed by President Anwar Sadat. Sadat, one of the Shah's closest allies, hosted him in a presidential palace and treated him like a king. The Egyptian press praised the Shah, portraying him as a victim of Islamic extremism. But the Shah's presence in Egypt caused diplomatic tensions. Many Arab nations despised him for his close ties to Israel and the West. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf monarchies pressured Egypt to distance itself from the Shah. As his health declined, the Shah knew he could not stay in Egypt forever. After a few weeks, he prepared to leave, hoping to find a permanent home elsewhere. Morocco, the first betrayal. From Egypt, the Shah traveled to Morocco, where he was received by King Hassan II. The Moroccan king had been a longtime ally, often seeking the Shah's guidance on military and economic matters. At first, Hassan II treated him with respect, allowing him to stay in a luxurious palace near Marrakesh. But soon the pressure from Iran's new Islamic government and international forces mounted. The Bahamas. Paradise becomes a prison. Next, the Shah arrived in the Bahamas, a Caribbean island he had once visited for vacation. The new Iranian regime demanded the Shah's extradition. Moroccan officials feared angering Iran, a major oil supplier and an emerging Islamic power. Secret meetings were held between Iranian and Moroccan officials to discuss turning the Shah over. Sensing the danger, the Shah fled Morocco in the middle of the night, once again, a homeless man in search of refuge. He had hoped for a peaceful stay, but instead, he found himself living under strict surveillance. The Bahamian government refused to grant him full residency, limiting his movements. Local authorities, under pressure from the US and Iran, monitored his every move. Rumors spread that Iranian agents were plotting to assassinate him. His security team was reduced, leaving him vulnerable to attack. The Shah felt like a prisoner in a tropical paradise. Desperate and fearing for his life, he realized he could not stay. He needed somewhere safer, somewhere that could offer better medical treatment. Once again, he was forced to leave, continuing his wandering exile. Mexico, a brief refuge, a growing desperation. By mid-1979, the Shah found temporary asylum in Mexico, staying in Cuernavaca, a resort town near Mexico City. He hoped that this would be his final stop, a place where he could settle down and live quietly. But soon his cancer worsened. His doctors had misdiagnosed him in the past, and his condition had deteriorated without proper treatment. He was in constant pain, suffering from fatigue, infections, and weight loss. His once commanding presence faded, replaced by a weak and sickly man who could barely stand. At the same time, his presence in Mexico became a political issue. Iran's new government pressured Mexico to expel him. The Mexican public protested, fearing that his presence could lead to diplomatic tensions. The Mexican government asked him to leave, making it clear he was no longer welcome. With nowhere else to go, he turned to his last hope, the United States. The United States, a visit that changed history. The Shah had been America's closest ally in the Middle East for decades. He believed that the US government would protect him in his time of need. He begged Washington for entry, claiming he needed urgent medical care. But President Jimmy Carter was hesitant. He knew that admitting the Shah would enrage Iran's new Islamic government. He feared that taking the Shah in could lead to another crisis. His advisors warned that Iranian revolutionaries might retaliate. After weeks of debate, the US reluctantly allowed the Shah to enter, but only for medical treatment. On October 22, 1979, the Shah was admitted to a hospital in New York. His arrival outraged the Iranian revolutionaries, who saw it as an American conspiracy. Just 2 weeks later, on November 4, 1979, Iranian students stormed the US embassy in Tehran. The Iran hostage crisis had begun. 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage. The hostage takers demanded the Shah's extradition to stand trial in Iran. Protests erupted across Iran, with millions calling for his execution. The Shah had become a liability, not just to the United States, but to the entire Western world. Carter, under immense pressure, asked the Shah to leave. Once again, he was forced into exile, his health failing more each day. The Shah's last journey, Panama and final betrayal. The Shah's next destination was Panama, where General Omar Torrijos reluctantly agreed to host him. Iran immediately pressured Panama to extradite the Shah. Secret negotiations began. The new Iranian regime was willing to pay Panama to hand him over. The Shah, realizing the danger, made a desperate plea to his last remaining friend, Anwar Sadat of Egypt. Sadat agreed to take him in, defying international pressure. In March 1980, the Shah fled to Cairo, knowing this would be his final destination. By this time, his body was breaking down. His cancer was untreatable. He had lost nearly all his strength. He barely resembled the powerful king he once was. The world had abandoned him. He had lost his empire. He had lost his throne, and now he was losing his life. Part 13. The Last Days of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, March-July 1980. By March 1980, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had reached the final stop of his long and painful exile, Egypt. He was now a broken man, suffering from advanced cancer, unable to return to Iran, and abandoned by his former allies. His once great empire was gone, and his name was erased from Iran's history books. With only months left to live, he spent his final days battling illness, reflecting on his past, and preparing for the inevitable. The peacock throne had fallen, and now the last Shah of Iran was fading from the world. Arrival in Egypt, a friend's last gift. On March 24, 1980, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and Empress Farah landed in Cairo, Egypt, greeted by President Anwar Sadat. Unlike other world leaders who had abandoned the Shah, Sadat welcomed him as an honored guest, treating him with the respect of a king. The Egyptian leader arranged a luxurious residence for the exiled monarch at the Kuba Palace. For the first time since leaving Iran in 1979, the Shah felt safe. He would not be forced to leave again. He would not be treated as a political burden. He would spend his final days in dignity. However, the Shah's condition was deteriorating rapidly. His cancer had spread, and he was weaker than ever. He could barely walk, relying on his wife and doctors for assistance. His immune system collapsed, leading to constant infections. Mohammad Reza knew he was dying. He avoided mirrors, unable to recognize himself in his frail and sickly state. He spoke less and less, lost in his thoughts and regrets. He hardly ate, unable to keep food down. The once powerful ruler of Iran was now a shadow of his former self. Medical crisis, a last attempt to save him. Despite the Shah's critical condition, his doctors were determined to save him. On March 28, 1980, Dr. Michael DeBakey, one of the world's leading heart surgeons, was flown in from the United States. He performed a risky splenectomy, removal of the spleen, hoping to slow down the Shah's cancer. During the operation, complications arose. His pancreas was damaged, leading to further infections. After the surgery, the Shah's condition only worsened. He developed high fever, internal bleeding, and severe pain. His weight dropped dramatically, and he could barely stand without assistance. The infection spread, and his organs began shutting down. The doctors knew there was nothing more they could do. The Shah was dying. His final reflections: regret, anger, and faith. As he lay in his bed at Kuba Palace, the Shah spent his final days reflecting on his life. He spoke often of his father, Reza Shah, blaming him for his harsh upbringing and insecurities. He criticized the Americans, believing that the U.S. had abandoned him in his greatest time of need. He wondered what went wrong, struggling to understand why his people had turned against him. He was angry, but also filled with regret. "I tried to modernize Iran," he whispered to one of his aides. "I tried to make my country great, and this is my reward?" "They called me a dictator," he told Farah, "but was I worse than Khomeini? Maybe I should have given them more freedom," he admitted. But they weren't ready. He spent hours reading the Quran, searching for peace in his final moments. He asked his wife Farah to stay close, holding her hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. He looked at old photographs, remembering the glory days of his reign. He spoke often of Iran, longing for one last glimpse of his homeland, but he knew he would never see Iran again. The last moments of the last Shah. By July 1980, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was too weak to move. He slipped into a coma, waking up only for brief moments. His breathing was labored, his body failing him. He held tightly to a small bag of Iranian soil, which had been brought from Tehran. On July 27, 1980 at 9:15 a.m., the last Shah of Iran took his final breath. His wife wept by his side, holding his hand until he was gone. His doctors stood in silence, knowing they had lost him. President Anwar Sadat declared a period of national mourning, honoring him as a great leader and friend. The Shah's funeral, a final act of honor. On July 29, 1980, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was given a full-state funeral in Cairo. World leaders attended, including President Sadat, former U.S. President Richard Nixon, and King Constantine II of Greece. His coffin was draped in the Iranian flag as soldiers carried him to his final resting place. He was buried in Al-Rifai Mosque next to King Farouk of Egypt, his former brother-in-law. A military salute was given and prayers were recited in his honor. Reza Pahlavi, his grieving widow, stood in silence, knowing she had lost the man she loved. In Iran, his name was erased from history. His statues were destroyed, his images burned. The new Islamic government declared him a tyrant, a symbol of corruption and oppression. His palaces were emptied, his legacy rewritten. But for those who had once admired him, he was remembered as a modernizer, a visionary, and a leader who tried to transform Iran into a great power. The end of an era. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had ruled Iran for 37 years. He transformed the country into a regional superpower, bringing wealth and development. But his autocratic rule, his failure to listen to the people, and his deep mistrust of democracy ultimately led to his downfall. His death marked the end of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. His dynasty had crumbled and Iran had become an Islamic republic. His dreams of a powerful modern Iran were left unfulfilled. In his final moments, he had only one thought: Iran. Iran is Iran, he whispered. Its land, its people, its history. Every Iranian must love it. And then he was gone. Part 14. The Legacy of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a ruler between vision and controversy. With his death in 1980, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran, left behind a deeply divisive legacy. To some, he was a visionary modernizer who brought economic growth, military strength, and global prestige to Iran. To others, he was a tyrant whose authoritarian rule, corruption, and Western influence led to his downfall and the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Even today, Iranians remain divided on whether he was a great leader or a failed autocrat. This is the story of his legacy, the achievements, failures, and controversies that shaped Iran and the world long after his death. 1. The Shah as a modernizer. His greatest achievements: economic boom. Under his rule, Iran experienced one of the fastest growing economies in the world in the 1960s and 1970s. Industrialization. Iran became a leader in oil production, manufacturing, and technology, rivaling even some Western nations. Modern infrastructure. He built highways, airports, universities, and hospitals, transforming Iran into a modern state. Nuclear ambitions. The Shah launched Iran's nuclear energy program, envisioning a country that would be energy independent. Education reforms. Literacy rates skyrocketed, with new schools and universities opening across Iran. Women's rights. He granted women the right to vote, work, and remove the veil, making Iran one of the most progressive nations in the Middle East. Military power. Iran's army became the strongest in the region, equipped with the latest American and European weaponry. For many, these accomplishments proved that the Shah had a vision. He wanted Iran to become a global superpower. He saw Iran as the next Japan or Germany, a country wealthy, industrialized, and powerful. He dreamed of a modern Persia where Iranians enjoyed Western luxuries while maintaining their national identity. But his greatest achievements also created his greatest problems. 2. The Shah as an autocrat, his biggest failures. Authoritarian rule. The Shah controlled Iran with an iron fist, allowing no opposition, no free press, and no democracy. SAVAK's brutality. His secret police, SAVAK, was infamous for torturing and killing political opponents. Elitism and corruption. His government was filled with rich elites who stole billions from Iran's wealth, while many Iranians remained poor. Western dependence. His close ties with the United States and Britain led many Iranians to resent his rule as a puppet of the West. Forgetting Islam, his push for westernization angered religious groups, especially clerics like Ayatollah Khomeini, who saw him as anti-Islamic. Ignoring the people. Despite rapid progress, he failed to listen to public discontent, dismissing protesters as misguided or traitors. The more modernized Iran became, the more disconnected the Shah became from ordinary Iranians. In cities, people enjoyed new freedoms, but in villages, they felt abandoned. Intellectuals demanded democracy, but the Shah silenced them. Religious leaders called for a return to Islamic traditions, but the Shah pushed secularism. His vision for Iran was grand, but his methods of ruling were flawed. 3. The 1979 Revolution, the Shah's greatest mistake. By the 1970s, the Shah was at the peak of his power, but also at his most vulnerable. Oil money flooded Iran, but economic inequality grew. The middle class demanded political reforms, but he refused to change. Islamists, communists, and nationalists united against him, forming an unstoppable movement. Instead of compromising, the Shah doubled down on repression. He imprisoned and executed activists. He banned political parties. He ignored growing protests, believing they would fade away. But they didn't fade. They exploded into a revolution. By 1978, millions of Iranians were marching in the streets, calling for his downfall. His once loyal army refused to shoot at protesters. His Western allies deserted him, with President Jimmy Carter refusing to send military aid. By January 1979, the Shah fled Iran, leaving his throne behind. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile and declared Iran an Islamic republic. The monarchy was abolished, and Iran's new rulers condemned the Shah as a traitor. The country entered a new era, one dominated by religious fundamentalism, anti-Western policies, and decades of conflict. Had the Shah reformed his government earlier? Had he allowed democracy and addressed inequality? Would the revolution have happened? That question still haunts history. 4. How Iranians see the Shah. Today, a divided legacy. Some Iranians remember him as a hero, a leader who tried to bring prosperity and modernization to Iran. Younger Iranians have grown up under an Islamic republic and only know him as the tyrant that the government describes. Many intellectuals view him as a tragic figure, a king with good intentions, but too blind to see his own mistakes. Even among those who oppose the Islamic Republic today, opinions on the Shah remain divided. Was he Iran's last great ruler? Or was he the man responsible for Iran's fall into chaos? The truth is somewhere in between. 5. The Shah's place in history. Visionary or villain? He built an empire but ruled with an iron fist. He modernized Iran, but ignored the voices of the people. He saw himself as a savior, but in the end, he lost his country. His rule was a paradox, a time of great progress and deep repression. Some compare him to Ataturk, saying he tried to create a strong secular state, but was too aggressive in his reforms. Others compare him to Napoleon, a man with big dreams, but a downfall caused by his own mistakes. One thing is certain, the Shah's rule shaped Iran forever. The Iran we see today, whether in opposition to him or in nostalgia for his rule, was shaped by his decisions. His dynasty may have fallen, but his impact on Iran's history will never fade. Part 15. The Fate of the Pahlavi Dynasty. After the Shah, with the death of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in July 1980, the Pahlavi dynasty, which had ruled Iran for over 50 years, came to an abrupt and tragic end. The monarchy had fallen, and the Islamic Republic of Iran was firmly in power. The Shah's family, supporters, and allies were now scattered across the world, living in exile and uncertainty. Many hoped for a return to Iran, but the reality was far different. The Pahlavis had become a dynasty in exile. This is the story of what happened next, the struggles, tragedies, and political aspirations of the Shah's family after his death. 1. Farah Pahlavi, the empress in exile. Farah Pahlavi, the Shah's widow, was left to carry the legacy of her husband after his death. She was only 41 years old, a widowed empress with 4 children, forced to live far from her homeland. After the Shah's death, Farah and her children moved to the United States and later to Paris. She became a symbolic figure for Iranian monarchists, representing the Pahlavi dynasty's lost grandeur. She advocated for Iranian women's rights, speaking against the restrictions imposed by the Islamic Republic. She dedicated herself to preserving her husband's legacy, attending events and interviews to keep the memory of the Pahlavi era alive. But life in exile was not easy. She lived under constant security threats, fearing assassination by Iranian agents. She struggled with loneliness and loss, watching Iran descend into war and repression. She was devastated by the tragedies that would later strike her family. Even today, Farah Pahlavi remains active, still hoping for a day when Iran will be free, though she knows she may never return to her homeland. 2. Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. The heir without a throne, Reza Pahlavi, the eldest son of the Shah, was only 19 years old when his father died. As the crown prince, he was seen by many monarchists as the rightful heir to the throne. But with the Islamic Republic firmly in power, his chances of returning to Iran as king were slim. Determined to continue his father's legacy, Reza Pahlavi focused on education and politics. He studied aerospace engineering in the United States, training as a fighter pilot, hoping one day to lead an Iranian resistance movement. He became one of the most vocal opponents of the Islamic Republic, giving speeches and interviews criticizing Iran's leadership. He called for a democratic Iran, saying that the future of the country should be decided by the Iranian people, not necessarily through a return to monarchy. But his role as the exiled prince was challenging. Many Iranians saw him as out of touch, a privileged royal living in exile while they suffered under the regime. His support base was divided, with some wanting a constitutional monarchy and others preferring a republic. He lacked the political and military power to launch a real movement against the Islamic Republic. Despite this, Reza Pahlavi continues to advocate for regime change in Iran. He remains one of the most recognizable opposition figures, though his influence has weakened over time. He has called for international pressure on Iran and supports the Iranian protest movements. Some still see him as a future leader, but whether he will ever play a role in Iran's future remains uncertain. 3. Tragedy strikes. The loss of 2 Pahlavi children. While living in exile, the Pahlavi family faced unimaginable personal losses. In 2001, Layla Pahlavi, the Shah's youngest daughter, was found dead in her London hotel room. She had suffered from depression and eating disorders, struggling with a life in exile. She overdosed on sleeping pills, leaving a note expressing her deep sadness and longing for Iran. Her death was a major blow to the Pahlavi family, especially to her mother, Farah. Then in 2011, tragedy struck again. Reza Pahlavi, the Shah's younger son, died by suicide in his Boston apartment. Like his sister, he battled depression, feeling isolated from Iran and burdened by the weight of his family's legacy. The loss of 2 children devastated Farah Pahlavi and the entire Pahlavi family. It showed the psychological toll of exile and how even royalty was not immune to deep suffering. Many Iranians, even those who opposed the monarchy, felt sympathy for the family's pain. The deaths highlighted the difficulties of living as an exiled dynasty, without a homeland, without a future. 4. The Pahlavis in Iranian politics today. Despite decades in exile, the Pahlavis remain part of Iranian political discussions. Monarchists in exile still hope for a return to the throne, though their numbers have declined. The Islamic Republic continues to demonize the Pahlavis, using the Shah's rule as a justification for their own power. Some young Iranians, frustrated with the current regime, have re-evaluated the Shah's legacy, seeing his rule as a better time for Iran. However, a royal restoration is unlikely. Iran's political landscape has changed dramatically, with religious rule deeply embedded. The younger generation is disconnected from the monarchy, seeing it as a relic of the past. Even among opposition groups, most prefer a democratic republic over a return to monarchy. Still, Reza Pahlavi continues his efforts to keep the Pahlavi name alive. He remains active in Iranian opposition movements, though he has moved away from advocating absolute monarchy. He has expressed support for a democratic Iran, saying that he wants the people to decide their future. Whether or not he plays a role in Iran's next revolution is still uncertain. The lasting impact of the Pahlavi dynasty. Despite its fall, the Pahlavi dynasty shaped modern Iran. The Shah's reforms, policies, and leadership left a permanent mark on Iranian history. His rule is still debated, with some nostalgic for the past and others condemning his dictatorship. The question remains, will the Pahlavis ever return to Iran? Can the dynasty rebuild itself in some form, or is it a chapter of history that is now closed? What role will Reza Pahlavi or his children play in Iran's future? Only time will tell. For now, the Pahlavis remain a royal family without a kingdom, a symbol of what was and what could have been. Final thoughts. The end of an era. The Shah is gone. The monarchy is gone. Iran is a different country now, shaped by a revolution that changed everything. But the Pahlavis still exist, and as long as Iran's future remains uncertain, their name will continue to be part of the conversation. Will they return? Will Reza Pahlavi ever lead a movement strong enough to change Iran? Or is the monarchy forever buried in the past? Only history will decide. For now, the Pahlavi dynasty remains in exile, waiting, perhaps in vain, for a day when they might return.